All right, good afternoon, everybody. This is Adam Evangelista, your host and confidant for the day. Welcome to another installment of AutoCAD Jumpstart as presented by KETIV Technologies. The date is August 27th, 2021. And we got quite a presentation here for you guys here today. Thanks for being here. So let me know if you guys have any questions as we get into this. This is a Zoom webinar, so feel free to reach out via I'm sorry, it's the regular Zoom meeting. So feel free to submit questions via chat or what have you, so I could pick that up. Just let me know if there's any issues with audio or with questions or content. Just I'm happy to stop and explain anything more from here. Okay. With that said, let's go ahead and get into it, right? Again, this is KETIV's AutoCAD Jumpstarts. Let's see what we got coming up over here. All right, quick agenda for the day, nothing too crazy, right? We're going to do some quick introductions. We're going to do an overview of the AutoCAD platform, just kind of talk about what the software is, what it does, what it doesn't do, what you could expect from it. And then most of today is going to be largely dedicated to a guided tour. So we're going to go around and kind of show you guys how to use the software at a kind of basic workflow level to make sure you guys have a good starting point for all the other types of work you guys are going to be doing in the future. Okay. So that's going to be the bulk of today. I have some resources that I could share with you guys at the end for additional learning as well, which are always very valuable. And of course, there's Q&A slotted at the end as well, but I'll be taking questions and any other concerns throughout the session as well. So no need to wait till the end of this at all. Typically, depending on the session, depending on how the audience reacts and stuff like that, we're talking maybe 2 to 3 hours, depending on our time. I always include a break somewhere there, maybe one, maybe two, depending on the room. But look forward to all of that as it comes through. Okay. That said, some quick introductions. That's me. We got professional headshots at the company a while ago, so that's always a pleasure. Glad to be here. My name's Adam Evangelista. I'm an application engineer here at KETIV Technologies. An application engineer ends up meaning a lot of different things, and I realize it's not terribly descriptive if you're an outsider. But that said, the application engineering role ends up taking on a variety of different responsibilities available at the company. KETIV, as you know, or should be aware of already, is an application reseller, right? We work largely with Autodesk, but we also work with ANSYS. Autodesk does a lot of CAD solutions, both 2D, 3D, data management, product lifecycle management, and stuff like that. We have applications that are relevant towards the manufacturing and design industry, the building industry, and also media and entertainment as well. And so as a consulting company, as a reseller of sorts, right, we do have to have a technical arm, and that's where the application engineers come in, right? They are specialists in the variety of applications that we have. And, for example, I'm familiar with Inventor, AutoCAD, Vault, and a bunch of other stuff at Autodesk as well, mind you, but feel free to ask. It was a great time, and I'm happy to discuss any of the kind of interdependent workflows that exist among all the different software as well, okay? But in addition to just being knowledgeable about the different software that we have here at KETIV, we also do lifeline supports. We also do training. We also do consulting. We do automation integrations and implementations and stuff like that. So feel free to reach out. I've had my hand in basically every part of the company at this point. So feel free to ask any possible question you could possibly have. Okay. Previous experience before here, I used to work at a makerspace over in Los Alamitos in Southern California. That was a fun little spot, kind of a community workshop type of thing with CNCs, laser cutters, 3D printers, and wood shop and stuff like that. So it's kind of fun, it's much kind of similar to what I do now, and that I still help people make things back then, but also now as well. And so plenty of stories from there, but I like to tinker, like this kind of technical stuff, and modeling is a lot of fun. So give me a shout if you guys have any questions about my industry or my experience, and hopefully we will be able to guide you through a good foundation of AutoCAD from here. Okay. AutoCAD's been around for a long time, right? It's been around since about 1982 in particular, so it's coming up on its 40-year anniversary coming up pretty soon. So if you guys are familiar with the industry back then, right? I mean, this is kind of the advent of like 3D modeling, and AutoCAD's been through a lot of different stuff back then, but 2D and 3D computer modeling used a lot for in a variety of different industries as well, right? So architecture is probably the one that most people think of, right, as a building application for layouts or floor plans or any kind of subsystem layouts and everything like that, right? So architecture is one of the main industries AutoCAD services, although you're going to see AutoCAD and Autodesk really frequently as it's relevant to the manufacturing industry and also civil engineering and infrastructure as well, right? And of course, there's a lot more than just plain vanilla AutoCAD. We'll be talking about the vertical shortly over there, but the idea is that regardless of your industry, you probably have a specific software that might be better suited for you than just plain vanilla AutoCAD. That said, AutoCAD has a long history, like I said before, right? So just around the advent of like the computer age and stuff, they of course pioneered the DWG file format. So any kind of 2D CAD drafter or any kind of CAD program nowadays should support DWG regardless, right? And in modern, most recent iterations, AutoCAD's also been kind of taking on some extra interesting features, kind of stuff like mobile device access, browser access, cloud access, and stuff like that, which we'll get a hint of when we get into the program later on. But just keep in mind, it's a pretty established, mature software that's still changing to this day. But hopefully this will again give you a good idea about the foundational aspects of AutoCAD as a software versus anything else. Okay. And so at this point, AutoCAD usually sold with something called a package called with specialized toolsets. So usually you guys are going to be buying AutoCAD with specialized toolsets specifically. And so just to emphasize, right, once you get this package, like you don't just get plain base AutoCAD, right? There's a good chance that if you're using AutoCAD, you might already have the specialized tool sets, but with the specialized tool sets, you get additional access to AutoCAD architecture, AutoCAD electrical, AutoCAD mechanical, Plant 3D, MEP, Civil 3D, all that good stuff is over here already in the program, already in the software, or already in the package that you have available to you, right? A bit more detail about these kind of different applications, right? They're all built on the AutoCAD platform. So you could imagine for mechanical, right? You could still draft and draw like in regular AutoCAD. However, in mechanical, you have an additional benefit of having a library of 700,000 intelligent manufacturing parts, features, and symbols, right? And so you get a bunch of extra workflows and a bunch of extra tools and whistles that you could use that are relevant to the mechanical industry, right? Similar for architecture, we're talking about block libraries, we're talking about floor plan libraries and stuff. I believe it's in architecture that they have the dedicated walling tool where you could kind of do that two-line kind of line style when you're pathing out floor layouts and stuff like that, right? Over here, there's also Map 3D. So, if you're working with GIS data, right, there's a lot of workflows that feed into kind of infrastructure and kind of, civil workflows in particular. And so not just Map 3D, but there's a bunch of other dedicated programs in the Autodesk umbrella that are all about infrastructure and buildings as well, mind you. But this is just the AutoCAD package specifically. There's roster design. So if you need to scan in old drawings, Plant 3D, if you need to do a process layout, both in 3D and in ISO, MEP for mechanical, electrical, and plumbing, and also electrical too. Electrical is definitely a ride too. So if you're doing like electrical schematics, ladder diagrams, or anything like that, electrical is definitely the way to go. Not that it's specific to electrical or much better than regular base AutoCAD, but there's going to be a lot of dedicated workflows that are relevant for electrical schematics, for example, right? So there's a lot of tabulation on like electrical and Plant 3D, for example, to keep track of different components that are available specifically in those verticals. That even though you could do something like smart attributes in base AutoCAD, it's a lot more smooth when you go to electrical or Plant 3D, for example. Okay. So just keep that in mind, right? We're going to be exploring base AutoCAD ourselves here today, but there's a lot of different flavors of AutoCAD that come along with it that you may already have access to. So definitely double check with your managers, whoever controls your contracts, because there's a good chance you might have the ability to maybe explore some of these other possibilities as well. Okay. I'm going to pause there. See if there's any questions out there. Anybody? We'll also take a nice sip of water over here, make sure everything's good. All right, and so we're going to be primarily using these sample files over here. And so before we get into the actual demo and everything, like we're just going to go ahead and look at this particular path over here. Okay. And so we're not going to quite use this quite yet, but I do want to make sure we know where this is exactly. This is a relevant file path for all year versions of the software, right? And so I have the XX over there, but I'm using 2022 today. But this comes with pretty much any install of AutoCAD in modern days. And we're going to go into architecture. We're going to go into res. We're going to go into exterior. This section over here is going to be where we want to look at stuff. So there's a bunch of DWGs here. We're going to be coming back to exterior elevations eventually, but just keep that on standby for now. Okay. That said, let's go ahead and jump into the guided tour. Again, let me know if there's any questions or concerns about anything going on over here. So just let me know. All right. And I already have the software open over here, but if you don't, a good way to launch it is simply just go through your start menu over here and just, type in AutoCAD, right? Even if you have something like AutoCAD Electrical, for example, AutoCAD Electrical also contains really useful stuff here as well. And so if you come in over here, I'm looking at like Autodesk or, sorry, what am I trying to get to over here? So I want to look at like AutoCAD Electrical from the 2021 release. If you have one of the verticals installed like AutoCAD Electrical, but you don't need electrical, you just need the base AutoCAD version. Under that same installation folder, so like AutoCAD Electrical, you can still access regular AutoCAD under AutoCAD Electrical if you want to, and it should be equivalent to base AutoCAD, just labeled differently. Okay, so that's always something good to keep in mind. This is just pure AutoCAD 2022, mind you, but what are we looking at over here? All right. And so this is what the home screen looks like. And again, I am in 2022. In fact, let me just expose the version that I have here at the moment, right? This is specifically product version 5.51.0.0, right? There are probably some other updates for AutoCAD out at this point, but just to be clear about what I'm going to be doing and what I'm going to be showing, right? You might have a newer version, you might have an older one, but again, this is the version that I'll be presenting here today, right? An additional fact as well, if you click manage license off of here, you can actually see your licensing status and even the expiration date of your seat whenever that's going to come due, right? If you ever get licensing help from our support team, they're going to typically ask you to go through these steps to look at the stuff over here, but you can do it yourself if you really wanted to, okay? Again, that's under the question mark pull down about AutoCAD 2022, and you're looking good, okay? And so this is what 2022 looks like. And this is notably different from previous releases just because, they're adjusting the appearances of AutoCAD as it comes through, right? And so everything might look a bit different, like I said, but all the functionalities are largely preserved over here. And you just got to take a moment to just kind of realize, right? Along the left over here, this is the start menu. You can't close out of it. But if you want to open up a file, you could go down here. You could just click open and it should bring up the browser, right? Like you might expect, of course. And there's even a pull down over here. If you want to open up a sheet set or explore sample drawings, it's all available there. Under new, you could also activate your templates, your .dwts, okay? And you could even browse templates if you have a template directory available for yourself. All that stuff is kind of here already, okay? And so that's going to be open, that's going to be new, it's going to be pretty standard ways to open and start new files, right? Over here in the main screen, of course, you have your recent files, which are going to show up as a list if you have the list option showed up. So exterior elevations, floor plan, all the stuff that we've done on previous presentations specifically, but you kind of have ideas of, you get a bit more information about what these files are. This little icon means that it's located locally on your machine, on your C drive in this case. You could pin it if you want to keep it relevant and up there, maybe open, read only or something. And you could even adjust some filter settings over here if you desire as well. On the other ends, this icon just changes it to a different tab thumbnail view, essentially, to give you a bit more idea of what's going on over here. They do have announcements along the right side now as well, which is always fun. Yeah, this used to be like the yellow number that you might remember from the previous AutoCADs and stuff like that, but it's just a bunch of announcements, right? So feel free to click on this, and this leads to like different Autodesk documentation and news posts, which, definitely keep an eye out. It helps you kind of figure out what's going on over there. It's no big deal. Insights, get personalized insights to maximize productivity in AutoCAD. That sounds pretty interesting, not too bad. And then here's the 2022.1 update they're talking about over here. So again, they're always working on this stuff, so always be on the lookout for more information. or call KETIV for more info. Yeah. And so that's all pretty standard. That's might be what you expect from a regular home screen, right? And there's a bit of extra stuff here on the home page as well that's worth talking about. A lot of the 2022 applications are working with Autodesk Docs, this kind of cloud document management service that they're pushing out right now. And so if you're ever curious about collaborating over the network or over a cloud network or something like that, Autodesk Docs is going to be kind of what you're looking for specifically. There's a bit of configuration associated there already, but if you're not using something like Vault and you need to collaborate across the cloud, Autodesk Docs is a component that's already largely there in the first place. So feel free to reach out if you want to talk more about that, and we could talk more for sure. Okay. The learning tab also makes a return as one of the different tabs over here along the left. You got all your learning tips over here. These are just kind of like, tips that you can look at to whenever you're just doing stuff, I guess. And so this all links out to like the different help information and stuff. And like, this is about the array command. So pretty basic information. So, it doesn't hurt to read it and be aware of it and all that, but it is here already. What's nice about AutoCAD too, I think, is that they do have like videos and tutorial videos available for you guys right off the bat, right? And these are in application. So like these are just here already with your installation. Turn off the volume over there, but they do a pretty good job about documenting new features, for example. And so there's a lot of videos like that here already, for example. But I'll just kind of go through and just kind of smaller chunks so I can kind of discuss what's going on and doing everything, right? So having a good time there. I definitely don't recommend to just skip them because they're not that bad. They're a good time. And when I first started, they just had me watch these videos for a little bit to get it to learn on my own already. But create 2D objects, modify 2D objects, all kind of stuff you would expect. So not necessarily comprehensive by any means, but it is a good place to start regardless. My personal favorite thing on here, though, is the Hitchhiker's Guide to AutoCAD. This has also seen some facelifts in recent years as well, but this is a bit more of a guided, comprehensive journey to getting started. And in fact, this is going to be the kind of basic workflow that we work through here today. Okay. And so again, if you're new to AutoCAD, there's a bunch of stuff that you kind of just need to know how to do basically, right? There's a lot more you could do than what's going to be presented in this guide, but as long as you even like are aware of all these different steps, you should be good to go. Right, but it's split up into a few different sections. So from basics to get started to design over to documentation, which again is a very fundamental workflow where again you start drawing, you start designing and modifying the geometry, and then you push it out and publish it to document space at the very end. Okay. And if you click on any of these buttons, right, it's just going to take you to that particular section. And it's kind of just, presented in kind of layman's terms, not directly from the help, but just kind of has some good commentary and good editorial tone to it as well. So it'll give you an idea about the intentions as in addition to the actual picks and clicks that are behind each command, right? And it's pretty much just, parent topic, previous and next, and you could just keep going through this until you feel comfortable, right? It'll have references to the actual commands, which, like circle, for example, relatively simple command, right? But a lot of extra information you can kind of glean from the documentation if you're so curious, right? So the Hitchhiker's Guide is always a good place to start just for, self-teaching and self-pacing and stuff like that. But, nothing too special. But I think the biggest part of it is that it is very superficial and it is very approachable documentation as well. So great place to start, and kind of it's going to be kind of what we work on here today as we work through this. Okay. So I guess that said, any questions so far? So let's kind of just very basic AutoCAD, how to get started in it, and what does the home screen look like here so far? Anything else new on this page? Nothing exactly. We have some more links down here, of course, which are just like external links. So like online help, community forum, customer support. This is all stuff that you could go to. And most of this is hosted on the Autodesk website, right? The Autodesk Knowledge Network, as it's so colloquially called. But yeah, there's a bunch of good stuff online. And so feel free to, nothing you couldn't find with a Google search, of course, but just be aware that that help is there. Okay. Let me know if you have any other questions. I'm gonna just keep plowing along, honestly, just see what happens, huh? Yeah, so some of the things you'll notice on the screen as well. you do have your toolbars up top, right? So if you come from a CAD background, you should be fairly familiar with like these like home, insert, annotate tabs and stuff like that. And I don't think all software has these buttons like, grayed out like this at the home screen over there. And so, usually the first question is, okay, well, how do I get into a drawing so I could start actually using some of these tools and stuff like that? Great question. There's a couple different ways. And so you have some other tools up here, right? These are like the classic file operations like new and open from vault, or, sync with web, stuff like that. And you could even toggle like the menu bar if you like the classic file specifically. But in addition, the big A over here will get you to some of the basic file operations you might be used to in the corner for a file pull down like this, okay? But simplest way, you could literally just click, the new file button up here, and that should start a new drawing for you. Right? New drawings are based on template files, right? Template files are distinct from regular DWGs in that they have a different file ending. So you'll notice that this says AutoCAD.dwt. The .dwt stands for drawing template, right? As far as I know, there's no real difference between DWG and DWT, at least in terms of like, what happens in the background, at least. I think the biggest difference is that the DWTs show up in these template filters specifically, right? And so ACAD DWT this is going to be super standard drawing, but you can see a bunch of other stuff like this is an ISO setting. This is for 3D. This one's for architecture. This one's for manufacturing. Some of them already have geometry or sheet layouts set up for you already. So most likely, if you're starting at a new job and this is your first day, your company probably already has some default templates for you guys to be using and utilizing in the first place. Okay. So just to get started, I'm going to double click on AutoCAD.dwt to go ahead and get started over here. Yeah, this is a completely empty drawing, so nothing too special over here. And you'll notice that instead of ACAD.dwt, this is now saying drawing.dwg instead, meaning that this is in fact a new drawing. So looking pretty good so far, huh? This is the model space, right? This is going to be the area where you're going to be doing most of your drawing and kind of working over here, right? You can see it's kind of a big grid-based layout. There's your origin point over here. You could use middle mouse wheel to click and drag and pan around over here, like so, right? You could also left click on stuff. You want to highlight stuff like the origin point, you could left click. You could always right click to get your context menu. So, extra options. If you're ever in doubt, you could literally just right click on something to figure out what else you could do with that object. Okay. Nothing too interesting over here. On the right, you do have something called the view cube over here. Now, I thought it was kind of interesting just because, most people think of AutoCAD as a 2D software, and in this case it does come with a 3D view cube right off the bat. And so if you wanted to, you could actually click around on this view cube and you can see the way that my origin triad updates, and that this is a truly 3D space, right? So X, Y, and Z. And for X, Y, and Z, that just means that you have the ability to mouse in and mouse out if you want to, and you could actually go and look at different sides of this view cube, right? Most people probably doing 2D work, right? But it is kind of good to know that it is available and you do still work and live in a 3D space. There's some dedicated tools and commands for 3D, mind you, but most people just end up turning this off ultimately, which is totally fine as well. And so if you want to turn that off, all you got to do is go over to your view cube or your view tab over here, right? And then you actually have toggles for certain elements on your screen. So like the view cube, for example, something I could untoggle, and now we're back in business. I talked to a lot of like old users and a lot of kind of veteran users of the software, and one of the big things, especially for more classic users, is that they're very protective over their screen real estate. And so stuff like that that's not even useful or like relevant, people are really eager to just get that out of the way because I need more space to draw, essentially, right? In a similar vein, you also have this thing called the navigation bar, right? You could toggle it off as well if you want to, but there's a few interesting commands that we'll come back to this in a moment after we finish explaining the rest of the UI over here. You have your cursor, of course, up top, and it's kind of a little crossbar over there. And if you click, you could start a selection window. Nothing to select on screen quite yet, but we could also just see what the other stuff is on screen over here. right? The bulk of AutoCAD happens in these toolbars up top over here, right? So obviously this is the home tab. All the commands and all the functions in AutoCAD are going to be largely organized into these ribbons and panels, right? I'm going to be using probably a variety of different language to kind of describe this stuff, but I call this the home tab, call it the home ribbon, call it the home section, or call it whatever the heck you want. The home tab does contain these panels though, and these groupings of different commands and everything. So home has, regular basic geometry. It has modified geometry, annotations, layers, blocks, properties, groups, utilities, clipboard view, a bunch of stuff, more than most people ever use, honestly. So we're not going to talk about every single one of these commands, but it is good to just have an idea of what they are and where they're coming from ultimately. Okay. And so home has a lot of basic starting operations over here. Insert, gets a bit more interesting. You could start inserting blocks. You could create more blocks, attributes, attach references, XREFs and stuff like that, PDF import, set location, do all this other stuff. Annotate, relevant tools for annotation, parametric, yada, yada, yada. It's also good to note that AutoCAD is relatively customizable as well. So this is a relatively modern UI, but if you guys are coming from like older versions of AutoCAD, there's a good chance you might be used to like the so-called classic AutoCAD layout with the smaller buttons and stuff like that. And if you're interested in that, just let me know. I could send you guys some documentation on that. It's not too hard to recreate, but in general, AutoCAD is pretty customizable, right? And so I think the only other one I would mention over here is probably the Express tools, right? The Express tools are kind of an interesting tab in that there's a lot of like experimental and a lot of kind of just more advanced commands showing up in the Express tools, for example, right? So like arc-align text isn't part of the regular text operations. It's actually a separate command under Express tools. And I've been told in the past that like, certain commands that exist in the Express Tools toolbar, eventually get incorporated into the main program somewhere else. But up until then, right, it's just kind of a list of useful features and commands just to be aware of that don't necessarily fit into the main tabs over here, right? Like replace block is a kind of common one that you see a lot, break line symbol, super hatch, all that good stuff is pretty relevant and really depends on what you need. But that's just the nature of AutoCAD, right? I also have a Vault tab on here. I won't be talking about the Vault connection here, but if you do have Vault and you need to check in files into Vault and out, probably looking at Vault tab over here where you could log in, check out. That's where all your regular stuff is going to be. Okay. So that said, that's, nothing too crazy over there. I already mentioned some of the file stuff up there. Yeah. Okay. So let's I guess just talk about some of the other useful mouse commands and operations that you could do here in AutoCAD, right? AutoCAD's great, and you have a bunch of different view options over here. And I'm about to get rid of this view bar myself, but it is good to note some of the different commands that are available over here. The first one obviously brings back the view cube, which, absolute classic. That's cool. This next option over here gives you this weird kind of like heads up view thing. I don't use it that often, but it's there if you want it. You can manually access the pan command from this button as well with a little hand on it, right? And if you ever want to execute a command or get out of a command, you can just press escape to end the command over there as well. You have this zoom button over here. This one says zoom extents, right? And in the pull down, there's actually a bunch of other ways to zoom here as well. So you'll see stuff like zoom window, zoom preview, zoom real time, all dynamic scale, all sorts of ways to zoom. I don't think any other program has as many ways to zoom, but you'll see why in a couple moments. There's also like orbit if you want to do 3D rotation, object mode, show motion as well. All this stuff isn't terribly interesting, right? And I mean, I think the best part of here is probably some of the zoom options that you have. I'm going to place some geometry down just so we have some reference, right? Something like that, something like that. All right, and if I go ahead and click zoom extents, the default option I have selected here, right? It's going to actually zoom me to the extent of this drawing, right? The drawing doesn't get much further away than these three circles. And so you can see it's kind of, it's zoomed into the extents of this drawing where it could fit it in, right? Which is pretty cool. And, if I were to like working super close over here and I was like starting to draw lines, having a good time like this, right? And I'm like, I want to zoom out right now. I could easily just go over to zoom extents if I wanted to. That'll zoom me back out so I could see everything that's going on over there, okay? What other types of Zoom are available in this presentation so far? Well, glad you asked. There's a bunch of other ones, like Zoom window allows you to drag a window over a certain part and then zoom your screen into that particular window. Okay. Zoom previous, you could go to the previous Zoom if you wanted to. You could do Zoom all, which again gives you kind of an all kind of access over there. Now, so I was stuck in the, I'll go to Zoom extents over there. Yeah, Zoom dynamic, Zoom center if you wanted to, Zoom object. I personally like Zoom extents and Zoom window for the most part, but there's a little different ways to get around. Personally, for me, like the pan from the middle mouse wheel combined with the zoom in and zoom out and the Zoom extents gets me to about everywhere I need to be. But again, that's, zoom in with the scroll wheel, right? Middle mouse wheel, if you click it down, mouse 3, you could pan around yourself manually. And if you even just double click middle mouse wheel, that'll give you an automatic zoom extents as well. And a lot of those shortcuts transfer to stuff like to Inventor as well, if you're curious about that. Okay. Okay. And so one of the other things you might be seeing going on as I go about and start using all of these different commands is that my command line ends up updating as well. So this big bit on the bottom is all about the command line, right? And this kind of harkens back to kind of AutoCAD's original inception. And kind of one of the more unique things about the application, I think, is that it has an active command line, right? It's really similar to kind of like old DOS operating systems or just command line operations. You have a command line where you could just input commands as you want to, right? You don't necessarily need to know how to program and stuff like that to go ahead and work with this stuff, but you can kind of see here, there's already a record of different stuff going on here as you just go about and press buttons and hit keys and everything like that, right? So like underscore line, for example, is an entry that you could use to initiate a line on your command or something like that. And you'll see I have a lot of like command cancels, for example. And command cancel happens when you press escape in particular, right? So it's really just kind of a running log and an opportunity to input commands if you wanted to yourself, right? And again, this is kind of like a really kind of distinct feature of AutoCAD, right? Where, I mean, something like Inventor doesn't have an explicit command line in the same way AutoCAD does. And what that means for us is that there's going to be multiple ways that you could access and interact with the program, right? The default, of course, is just, go press a button up on the browser, right? Just go click line, you're drawing lines and your command line's doing its thing. It's doing its best to keep up from here. Okay, not that exciting. However, you can also just go down to the command line. You could type in line, right? And should have like an autocomplete, like if you're familiar with some, different IDEs and stuff like that. It's just, going to help you autocomplete your stuff. Like line, for example, it's going to tell me, it's just going to activate the command on screen so I could start clicking around and doing my thing. Great. Gets a bit more interesting depending on what command you get, of course. And so my example at the beginning is always to talk about zoom in particular. So type in zoom, go and click enter. Notice you haven't zoomed yet, which is great and all, but in reality, zoom's actually asking you for a bit more information over here, right? And so right now it's like based in real time. So it's just going to be regular zooming with my mouse wheel, and it's real, right? But you'll notice after the initial zoom down here, I'll zoom in just a little bit, right? It's going to have all your different options for zooming in and out. So the different ways you want to zoom, right? Do I want to zoom extents? Do I want to zoom window? Do I want to zoom a particular object? That's all opportunities you have to kind of iterate on this command, right? And if you want to get to those different commands from here, you could just type in like, zoom extents. And that should go ahead and execute zoom extents, right? And even this, there's a lot of different ways to react to this, right? And so, you don't have to type it in manually by any means. You could also just like click on a particular button over here, right? There you go. And you'll notice that when I do the zoom command, right? When I do the zoom command, each of these buttons, right, are clickable, but they also have one letter highlighted in blue, which represents the kind of hotkey that you could press at this point to kind of initiate the command from here. So again, like zoom extent starts with an E, so you just hit E, you press enter, and that's going to get you zoom extents as well, right? So AutoCAD does a lot to kind of just like auto complete your statements and try to, understand what you're trying to do. And a lot of it's pretty intuitive, like surprisingly so, I would say. It's like line, you know, like what do you think the command is for line? Okay, well, you just need L, and you can just press enter, and then you could start going through there, right? Now, similarly, you could use space as like an entry button as well. So, you know, if I just have both my hands on my keyboard, I type in L, I press space, and I'm initiating the command itself already over there as well. So, you know, a lot of people, what they end up doing is that they'll have one hand on the keyboard and then they'll have another hand on the mouse, and they're just zipping through, man. They're like typing in like, you know, AL, like space, L space, L space, and they just keep typing stuff in there. So you could get really fast with AutoCAD if you really wanted to, but I think that's the big thing to keep in mind, is that there's a lot of different ways to kind of approach the program and like go through and just use it specifically, right? And it's a good chance that there's a way that the software could work for you that's comfortable and intuitive for you as well, okay? I haven't talked much about selection. I think I already talked about how, you know, you could of course click on an object if you wanted to, or right click on it to get more context options, of course. But what this really means, right, is that you're basically opening up a selection set. And so once I click on a line like this, for example, I get these handles, or pick points they're often called as well. And you can just click and drag these suckers around, man. Like just, you know, like you maybe expect, click and drag, moving around center, rotate a little bit, right? A lot of AutoCAD is just this, is moving around small little points to other small little points, for example, right? And that's great, that's dandy, that's a great way to select things just with a single click. You'll notice that once you click on one, you can click on another, and you can click on another. Oh, excuse me, I just sneezed. And you could keep clicking on stuff, and it's going to keep adding to your selection set. And then when you go back and start moving everything, right, it's going to be able to either use that for a command or just, you know, move individual pieces, whatever you want, really. So it'll depend on what you need ultimately. And you may have seen me also use a different selection method, which is using a selection window, right? The selection window will allow you to select multiple objects without having to click on multiple objects, which I think is a godsend personally. I think it's great. But there's two types of selection windows. There's green, and then there's blue, and then green, more accurately. And so depending on which direction you pull your window, right? So if I click once, right, and I drag my mouse out, it's going to give me a selection window, right? If I go left to right specifically, it's going to be an exclusive window. So anything that's fully inside of the square is going to be selected. Anything that's not fully inside of the square is not going to be selected, right? So you see like some of these larger rectangles and circles aren't going to be showed up over here because they're not fully inscribed inside of this rectangle, right? That's the opposite is true. If you go right to left, right to left, it's going to literally select anything that's touching this area of rectangle, which I like a lot myself. I think that's probably the most intuitive for me, but it's really common to just like, you know, come in here, throw out like a sweep like that, and then just delete stuff like that, you know. That's really intuitive to me, I think. But yeah, it definitely depends on your preference. If you click and drag in particular, you'll get something called the lasso. Right, and the lasso is kind of nice because you get a bit more control over where that area is going to be, right? So especially using conjunction with the blue selection box, right? I could be pretty particular about like what I'm going to end up picking up. So something like that. And these are the only parts that I wanted to pick up or something, right? Delete those. I don't know. The same thing works in the clockwise, counterclockwise direction as well. You just have a lot of options on how you kind of maintain and draw stuff from here, okay? I'm going to pause here for a moment, but are there any questions or concerns? A lot of that's just kind of like basic, like interaction with the software and kind of what it does. You know, left click, right click kind of stuff. So let me know if there's any questions or concerns over here. I'm going to pause. Okay, so we're back in it. What else is going on over here? I guess a few other last things I want to specify in terms of like user interface and stuff like that is that you do have a lot of options along the bottom over here. So these are, you know, pretty much hieroglyphs at this point, right? So what is all this stuff at the bottom over here? So there's a lot of different icons over here, and I'll highlight a few of them just because they are important to know and be aware of. But essentially what you're looking at over here is a bunch of extra document settings, essentially. So, display settings, like do I want to display the grid? You could toggle that on or off. Something called like snap mode, and there's also like something called orthogonal mode. Nothing too crazy, and we'll come back to some of these as we show up over here, but certain things like show line weight, for example, isn't always visible on someone's screen, which is an important one that we'll talk about. But you could always go to your some of your additional options. 3 lines over here are going to actually be a toggle of different information. So this actually corresponds to what you're seeing down there, right? So model space, grid, snap. If you want the transparency toggle over there, you could pretty much put, all of the stuff in there if you want, one way or the other. So that's definitely something helpful to be aware of. But I'll call those out as we get into it, because those will be more relevant once we actually start drawing and stuff like that. Okay. Okay. So cool. Let's see where we're at here so far. I think what I want to start with now is probably talk a little bit about drawing and some of the inputs of AutoCAD, right? How does it work? How do we expect it to work? And then we could jump into layers and properties and do all that classic stuff. Okay. So I think to start, let's go back to the line command. Again, you could start this line command like 10 different ways. I'm just going to click on the button up here. If you mouse over any of these commands as well, it will give you a preview along with some notation that'll kind of make sense, right? So this is literally just 1, 2, 3 clicks, and you could make your lines accordingly, right? And you also notice that there is this small little symbol down here with this kind of like yellowish window. I'm not sure what to call that really. If I have to pop up again. Oh, it doesn't want to pop up anymore. That's cool. Okay. All right. Never mind. I was going to say that yellow window represents the hotkey command line that you could use. Yeah. So this one right over here. Right. So line in this case, you type in line to access the line command, which isn't that crazy, I'm sure, but it's there if you need it or need to clarify something else. That said, what else can you do at this point? The line commands. You'll notice a few things when I start this particular command. And one of them is that your heads up display does change over here, right? And so your cursor actually is going to mostly have inputs that you could use at the cursor itself already as well. And this is something called like dynamic input in particular. So you could actually just put in coordinates without having to look down at the command line, right? One way or the other. But in this case, it's asking me for what's the first point going to be, Adam? And the first point, obviously, these look like ordered pair coordinates, right? And so that means that, we are on a Cartesian XY plane in this particular example with, the origin being 0, 0, of course, the first region being positive, 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 negative, 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 positive, right? So that makes sense. And just if you want to coordinate your model and your drawing that way, you could absolutely do that. So, like 5 is going to be the start of my line. And then, maybe it's going to go like 5. Oh, I'm sorry, that's a polar radius after that. But, you get the idea. I could start at like 0, 0, for example, and then start drawing my line. And then I have every confidence that this 0, 0 point is in fact 0, right? And so that's one way you can kind of interact with dynamic input. And some people don't like that, like genuinely don't like that. And you could just turn off dynamic input mode with this toggle in the bottom right that we talked about earlier, right? I love it. I'm not going to get rid of it, but it's all there, of course. And as you start drawing, you'll kind of like notice some other information. So even after the first click of line, there's more stuff to talk about, right? What the heck is all this? Well, it's a length and it's also a direction. So kind of like a velocity and a bearing, I suppose. I don't know. But these are also inputs that are going to go to define the line, right? So once you define the first point, right, you're going to be given additional inputs to define the next point, right? This will change on command and everything like that. But obviously for the line, you just need a length that's going to be completely strengthened. You're going to need to know a direction as well. And so as you mouse around, you're going to see those values update, right? There's 180. And it's going to be, within the smallest angle to the horizontal, of course. And so, doesn't necessarily go to 270 or anything like that, although it still does take 270, mind you. So you could put in your own values if you want to. So like, let's say I have a chord of 5 or something like that, right? And then I go over, I could hit tab and I could actually go to the next input and you'll see that in fact, 5 gets locked into place, right? While my regular, bearing direction doesn't, right? So that means that I could keep moving around, that I could keep flying, and now I just need to specify the degree, right? If I don't like that, I could just go back to 5, actually meant 6, and then switch back to something else I could keep rotating or something like that, right? In a similar way, right? If I type in 45 and then went up over here, right? That's already been set. So, but if I started at like 45, for example, and then moved up, right? Now this is like some tromboning action right here, right? So you get a lot of control over that and what you do, and how you apply lines and everything like that. Okay. Is there anything else to mention on the second click? Perhaps. No, I don't think so, actually. So once you get into that, right, I mean, it's obviously just kind of keep clicking to start, closing stuff and to start making loops and shapes that you might be interested in. Again, you could hit escape to end the command. And if you want to resume the command, you could always press the button again, but you could also use space, and space will actually initiate the last command that you just input, which in this case was line, right? So when I do certain drawings, I know people always they're like, oh, how'd you start the line command so fast like that? And I literally have one hand on like escape and one finger on the space bar. And so my other hand is on the mouse. I'll start clicking, right? Bop, 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 escape, space, bop, 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 escape, space, bop, 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 bop. And then you're just like flying at that point, right? So that's a really common kind of workflow as well if you need to place down multiple lines and do stuff like that, okay? You'll notice as we go through and start like placing geometry with other geometry on screen, you get kind of these green points that start to show up, right? Like these green, like what the heck is that? These are something called object snaps in particular, right? So obviously we're in a computer and, we're kind of just having a good time, and the computer needs to know specifically how these points are kind of related to each other, right? Otherwise, we're just kind of drawing freehand on an infinitesimally, infinite small line, right? And so what you're seeing is those green points are something called object snaps, which essentially just snap your cursor to a particular point of interest, whether that point of interest is an endpoint, whether it's an intersection point or something like that, or perhaps it's just like an extension of another line or a horizontal. There's all sorts of stuff like that could help orient your next click essentially, right? And so this is literally just kind of extra geometrical information about your drawing that you're kind of using and taking advantage of over here, right? So keep an eye out for like the symbols, right? So like the square represents an endpoint, for example, and like, the X will represent like an intersection, and there's all sorts of different stuff which we'll talk about, but that part is especially important for actually making good designs and making good regions, essentially, right? I didn't mention it here, but in the line command, there's actually some other stuff you could do once you have a couple lines down, right? If I wanted to close the square, I could just go and snap to the endpoint, but I could also just right click and then hit close here as well. And close will allow me to end the line at that particular point. Again, kind of mathematically speaking over there, right? And you'll notice that once I have 3 line segments down, if I press the arrow key down while my command is active, I'll actually get some extra options over here, including close, which we just saw on the right click, right? So that's actually 2 ways to get to this close command if you need it, right? And so I could hit close and hit enter, and those are both ways to kind of close geometry. Do we need to do that? Kind of, sort of. Let me talk about that next, and I think we might talk about that after the break, in fact. But yeah, that's kind of just the early intro to kind of drawing and placing down geometry. I think we're going to take a quick break here, if you guys don't mind, and then I think we're going to come back and start on the object snaps and everything else from here. All right, welcome back, everybody. Thanks for coming back. Hope you're having a good time here so far. We left off, I was talking about object snaps. The reason I broke there just because object snaps are kind of a big concept and something to be aware of when you're drawing and stuff like that. So it's probably the next big step on this journey as well, mind you. But let's see what else we got going on over here, right? This on screen, bunch of scribbles that, are loosely connected and they look pretty good here so far, but, we could do better, right? I mean, we need to do better, especially if we're getting paid for this type of work, right? So first off, right, I kind of mentioned this idea about closing and having coincident endpoints and stuff like that on these profiles, right? By default, object snaps allow you to do this pretty well, right? Just like that. And this is a decent square, right? This is going to do its job. It's going to be a closed region. If I were to toggle off object snaps like so, right? Object snap over here, F3, O snap. And I'll try to do the same thing, right? So this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy, coming off over here. See, I don't really get that snap over here. I don't get any of those green symbology stuff over there, right? Cool, fine. I don't care. I'm living life on the edge, man. What if I just go ahead and click there anyways because it looks close enough, right? Maybe I zoom in a little bit just because I'm like, okay, well, I want to be careful that we get that. Ooh, right there, right? And you can tell from even from this, right, that that's not a closed region, but you don't have to zoom in very far to kind of know that it's broken, right? However, even at this distance, right, you can't tell that that's not a closed region, right? It's not the end of the world by any means, but there's a lot of commands that depend on closed region. There's a lot of commands and dimensions that depend on accurate lengths and everything like that. You don't really want to be fudging around with this kind of weird ambiguity in these common like points here that don't snap together, right? And that's genuinely the whole point of object snaps, is to make sure that your picks are accurate and they're precise, right? That they're actually where they need you, where you need them to be ultimately, right? Again, it comes into play for a variety of different commands and different functions, but ultimately you just need to know with confidence that you're placing a line at the place where it needs to be placed, right? And that transcends pretty much everything and kind of affects every command that you're going to be doing from here. So should you have object snaps toggled on? Yeah, absolutely, you should. There's a bit of nuance to that too, of course, and we could take a look a bit more specifically at the different object snaps that are available. So something like this, right? This is the pull down menu over here, but you can see there's a bunch of different options over here, right? So endpoint, midpoint, center, geometric center, node, quadrant, intersection. There's all these different kind of references that you can pull. And you'll notice that not all of these were relevant when we started just drawing ourselves, right? I mean, endpoint, center point, intersection all showed up, extension showed up. But there's some cool stuff too, like perpendicular, tangent, near apparent intersection seems like potential, right? There's a parallel snap and stuff like that. So you can actually toggle more options on here if you really wanted to. And so like quadrant and tangent are like both particularly useful objects, especially when you start drawing with arcs and circles and stuff, right? We can get a bit deeper into this. And if I right click and I go to object snap settings, right, here we are now. You can actually take a look at the different toggles that are available over here, right? So same exact information as what we saw previously, but you could just go through and toggle all the bits that you want. So like midpoint's a popular one, for example. Quadrant's really helpful. Perpendicular, we'll see. Tangents, let's see. And let's just go with that for now. Even this is honestly more than you probably want. But let's put some circles down here as well, maybe start drawing some lines. And as you start moving your mouse around, you notice that cursor does bring up more information. So like this brings up a midpoint of this particular section. Notice that it's a triangle symbol now as well. Now I could go to the circle and I get this kind of perpendicular point on the circle. I get these quadrant snaps on the circle. I get the center snap on the circle and stuff like that, right? There's a lot of good information out here, and it really depends on what you're trying to do, like, how accurate you need your clicks to be. And the only reason I advise to not just have all of them on all the time is because sometimes there's too many solutions at any particular point there, right? So like, let's say I'm trying to place a point somewhere along this arc or something, right? There's a lot of potential solutions where my cursor could potentially snap to, right? So there's tangent, there's intersection, there's a bunch of stuff over here, there's quadrant snap, there's a bunch of other stuff, intersection and stuff like that. And so you don't always get the pieces that you need. And there's not like a really obvious way to just kind of see which one it's going to snap to, right? In this case, I just wanted to snap to the center, but there you go. Normally, if I snap this all off, right, you could just kind of grab center that way just by mousing over the center if you really wanted to do it that way, but it depends, right? And what's really nice about kind of the setup is that, you could make it however you want to, right? So your defaults, whatever are going to be available every time you initiate a command, you could set that to be whatever you want to. And generally speaking, like, less is more a lot of the time, right? Like, I don't think you always need endpoint all the time, for example. Center makes a lot of sense, and even quadrant does, but you probably don't need that for most purposes. Tangent is always a helpful one. Extension, I do think, is good, and probably not perpendicular, but, well, maybe we do perpendicular. I don't know. It's, like perpendicular would look something like that, right? And that would be a perpendicular 90-degree angle over there, which would do our purposes, right? What I recommend to people, though, like one of my favorite kind of hot tricks is just hold shift and then right click And what this is another similar kind of snap menu that's available to users, right? But this is specifically a snap override, right? So this isn't really a command per se, it's just a snap override for your next click. And so let's say, for example, the next click that I have to do is going to be like a midpoint somewhere, right? So I could just click on midpoint like so. And now, oops, well, let me start a command first. That would make more sense, huh? I'm going to start a command like the line command, and I need to start a line at the midpoint over here. So I'm going to hold shift, right click, and then I'm going to go to midpoint, and this will be my new snap override. You'll notice that all my other default snaps, like my endpoint, intersection, perpendicular, all that stuff doesn't show up. The only one that it cares about now is simply midpoints. And so this is a midpoint, this is a midpoint, and those are theoretically the two nearest ones that I could possibly click on. And so what's interesting about snaps in general too is that you don't have to be exactly on the snap position to use it, right? As long as it's highlighted like this, and I were to click, for example, even though I'm off that point, it's still going to start over there because that's the whole point of a snap, right? Just to put it on that point. So there's a bit of wiggle room that you have when you're actually placing and selecting those different features and everything like that. And what's nice that once you actually place that selection and do something for that first click, you're back to your regular default snaps, right? So now I could go to endpoint, now I could go to tangent or perpendicular, I could do everything else that I want to, but midpoint notably not selected there. So, we're kind of living off of that. But you could do the same thing where you right click and then you click midpoint again, and you could snap to another midpoint. This is something that pretty valuable to be aware of, right? And so, my snap settings generally look a lot less than this. And so for demonstrative purposes, I think it makes a lot of sense, but like perpendicular is kind of annoying, and even extension might be a bit dubious sometimes as well, but less is more. And then you could also shift right click to override your snap to get access to the more obscure ones that only come up every once in a while to make your life easier, right? And so yeah, that's something to keep in mind. And as you get into more complex layers and more complex geometries, right, that's going to be more and more apparent, like how many possible snaps there are on the screen at every given point. So something to keep aware of, just to, be sure to play that up a little bit. Okay. And so anything else to say about snaps? Any questions about snaps here or there? Of course, you could toggle that on or off. There's some other types of snaps that are available here as well. And one of them you might be kind of noticing, this one's really subtle, but once you mouse over a point, it actually leaves like this little mini cross over there, right? This kind of mini green one. And what that is, that's just kind of like an extra reference point, like a temporary reference point that you can use for your snapping from here. And you'll notice that when I go through, and I could actually use that as a reference all the way out here. And so if I wanted to start drawing a line that was horizontal to this point all the way out over here, well, guess what? It's right there, right? You could still draw that horizontal, and you could pull all the way out over there, and you're like living, man. You can make horizontal lines, and you should feel confident that that's going to be a horizontal with that original point when you do that, right? I believe it's something I've heard called like scrubbing. So, you can kind of like scrub a point a little bit, and once you scrub off like that, it's going to leave that little mark like that as a point of interest that you could then do horizontals to, right? Or, extensions, I suppose, if you need them. And you can do multiple lines like this too. So, mouse over a certain point, and like now you can do that over here as well. And the previous ones are still persistent. And so, if I wanted to do something like, this, or actually I know what I want to do. Like if I wanted to do something like this, I'm going to mouse over here, right? That's a point of interest. This is another point of interest. All right, what if I were to just simply start this out here, do the horizontal, and then I want to do like straight down over here. All right, I'm going to pull off that reference point and then snap it over here as well. And now that's like a perfect horizontal kind of 90-degree bend. In a similar vein, you have other snap stuff like ortho mode was a common one that showed up a lot, where it'll like restrict you to 90-degree bends, right? So kind of the same idea, but another way to get to that kind of thing, right? So you could turn off ortho mode. I don't use it that often. It's good to be aware of the different radial settings as well. There's like radial angle snaps as well, right? And where are those? I think that's this one over here. So these are polar tracking settings in particular. They're really similar to object snaps, except it's more specifically talking about the individual increment angle where your mouse is going to pick stuff up at, right? By default, I believe it comes in as 90. So by default, 90, 90, 180, 270, right? So the quadrants of a circle, right? Oh, maybe not. Do I have it on? I don't think I have it toggled on, huh? Oh, there it is. Now it's on. And now I could like toggle up to 90, 0, 180, 270, having a good time, right? There's other options here too. So, I mean, some people would think 45 makes a lot of sense for a lot of people, right? Where now I could do 90, 0, 45 angles, and I could do top without having to do much more extra work on top of that, right? So that's kind of a convenient feature to be aware of. I don't always use it myself, and you could get really granular, like every 5 degrees you could have a snap if you really wanted to, which is kind of crazy. Look at that rave action right there. Cool. But depends on your preference ultimately, right? So, and you could even make your own custom ones if you really wanted to. So I used to like demonstrate with some random ones over there, but I don't know anyone that needs increments of 17, for example. But up to you, however you want to do that. And you could toggle polar tracking on or off if you need it to. And all these tools kind of just contribute to your overall efficacy and accuracy when placing your objects and drawings here, okay? Okay. Any questions here so far? Let me take a pause over here. Anyone got any questions? Huh? That's cool. Okay. Just to make sure I'm staying honest over here, let's take a look back at the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy to see what else is going on exactly, right? And so we talked about basics, we talked about some of the view options, and we did talk about most geometry. I think I might take a stint around the circle and stuff. Maybe we'll talk about that shortly here as well. Yeah, so a lot of good stuff over here, and these are all kind of basic drawing commands, which I won't go too into, but if you want more information, that is here already. Talked about precision, and so kind of how you do snaps and how to get. This is a good example too of like the different kind of icons and iconography that's associated with everything, right? Well, very important. You'll kind of just pick up on that itself, right? You don't have to read and Egyptian hieroglyphics to use AutoCAD, but it's good to kind of have an idea, and it'll come with time pretty easily. And I guess there's one more snap too I want to talk about. So let me let's talk about a few things more before we move on here. And so in addition to everything over here, right, and I kind of just glossed over like circles and lines and squares and stuff like that, but like circles, come with a variety of different solutions as well. There's only one way to make a line in this particular case, but you could see under the circle option, there's multiples here as well. So you could define a circle using center radius, center diameter, 2-point, 3-point, tangent, 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 all sorts of different ways to kind of use circles, right? I hope these are pretty self-explanatory, of course, but center radius takes a radius, for example, center diameter takes a diameter instead. And similar like 2-point just kind of does that. Kind of see the way the geometry moves and is a bit more dynamic. It's kind of interesting stuff, right? And similarly, you could do something like tangent, tangent. And you'll notice this is something that comes up in 3D modelers as well, like Inventor, where when the command starts and it's like asking for a particular selection set, in this case, 2 tangent points and a radius, right? It's going to only let you choose tangent points, right? And so like certain things like, well, I guess most of these points count as tangent, huh? But it's essentially going to filter and apply a tangent kind of definition to the point that you choose. So it's going to be tangent to this object, tangent to this object, and there you go, something like that, right? So now that's kind of a neat way to define circles, I always thought, but circle 3 points, there's always only going to be one circle that could go between those 3 like that, right? It's kind of cool. And again, if you wanted to, you could access a lot of these commands through the command line. So I believe hotkey circle is, just circle. Like you have to write out circle, right? But again, even if my mouse is just here in the workspace, I could just type in C, I could press enter, and it's going to start the line command for me down over here. And I could start choosing 3-point, 2-point, or tangent, tangent, radius, or something like that. And that'll be an option to get to those commands as well, right? There's stuff like arcs up here as well, which have another variety of definitions over there, right? But just kind of be aware that there's a lot of different stuff like that. There is something called a polyline, which you guys might be interested in as well. And so let's talk a little bit about polylines. Yeah, I guess to start, right, I could turn on ortho mode over here, and maybe I just want to draw like a square, comme ça. looking for those horizontal points. You see how I came to that first corner to get that reference so I could draw horizontally? That's great, right? I'm going to also do the same exact thing, but with a polyline in particular. They don't have to be exactly the same in this case, but something like that might be kind of cool. And so these two objects aren't necessarily different, right? Well, I take it back. They are necessarily different because they're made with two different types of objects. So this is a line and this is a polyline. This is a line, this is a polyline. Notice that if I click the top edge of the regular line object, it's going to only pick up that particular edge, which totally fine by me, but what happens when I choose the top edge of the polyline, right? If I choose the top edge of the polyline, I'm actually selecting the whole object, right? And that already gives you kind of a hint about what polylines are. They're kind of just a continuous object, even if they're made of multiple line segments, right? And that's already an important distinction. And similar to before, right? Like that kind of distinction ends up affecting various commands in the future, like hatching and stretching and stuff like that. A bunch of stuff may or may not go on, depending on what you're trying to do. But kind of the main difference, right, is that with the regular line object, you're making individual lines that happen to be coincident at the end, right? And when I click and pull all these edges and stuff like that, right, things kind of change with it, right? I mean, they do try their best, but they're not really connected at the end of the day, right? They're four individual line objects, whereas a polyline, they're considered one continuous object while having multiple edges. In fact, this goes a bit further in that now, yes, you could actually pull and stretch and kind of keep stuff connected depending on what you do over here, right? This isn't a true close here as well, so that's actually my fault. I didn't make a true rectangle here. One more way to make a rectangle is using the rectangle tool over here, though, which should give me a closed region, I believe. And this one I shouldn't be able to pull apart at the corners, or at least I shouldn't be able to break at the corners, I should say. Right, something like that, right? And so, it's kind of an interesting thing. And I mean, there's some various nuance, and it'll depend on what you're trying to draw, right? Where you need things to be connected or not. But generally, polylines are pretty useful, and they're pretty easy to manage, even in there's very few cases where you would rather use a regular line versus a polyline, I would say. But depends, and it's not a huge deal. Just be aware that you have all of them kind of available to you. And so those are kind of three different ways to make the same rectangle, right? Which one do you prefer? I mean, I think the rectangle option probably makes the most sense, right? Because it actually closed the region automatically. I could have done that with the polyline too, but I didn't close it using a close function there myself, but I digress. Next question is like, hey, Adam, like, how do I even freaking know if it's like a line or a polyline? Isn't that kind of concerning if I have two identical rectangles and I don't know which one I could pull apart and which one's going to stay together? That's a fantastic question, dude. Let me talk to that. And so that's another big thing. And so once you're comfortable with like drawing and basic geometry and stuff like that, it's good to kind of keep in mind how AutoCAD operates from here, right? I'm obviously skipping over kind of modified geometry because it's not that important to this discussion, but kind of what happens next from here is that, you populate your drawing with various types of objects. You draw shapes, you draw squares, you draw circles, you draw polylines, what have you. What happens next is that each of these objects are defined by a variety of properties. And if you want to see these properties, what you got to do is essentially just type in properties and then hit enter, right? Just like that. And this is, I think, one of the more useful things, well, not one of the more useful things, but this is a super important thing to kind of understand about AutoCAD and about how it operates and how it treats all its different objects on screen and stuff, right? I could click an object like this line, for example, and it's going to give me a variety of information about that particular selected object. In this case, you see that right away, this is in fact a line, right? It has a color, it has a layer, it has a line type scale, all this other information regarding its, object, has geometry, it has coordinates over here, it has all of this information that effectively define this unique object, right? Which is great, that's fantastic. And one line's not that interesting, but I mean, I could click on a polyline, very similar stuff. And in the same way, it's going to have all these different properties about the general, the geometry, and also miscellaneous, like this closed option. Some stuff you can choose and fiddle around with over here. Like I wouldn't say you would do a lot of editing of the properties all the time, but something like close, like I could click yes, and that'll close this object in particular, which is pretty neat in itself. It actually finished that geometry for me, right? And if I wanted to change something that instead of 97, it's like 100 now, right? It's going to move that object over there, right? So it's kind of an extra way to edit and work with your particular features if you really need them. I think this is like especially pronounced when you start working with like circles, for example. Again, I'm typing in prop and hitting enter, but if I click on a circle like this, I might be interested in, it's probably not a good circle. This is a good circle though. Circle has a radius and I could set this up to be like 3, for example, right? And so that's a kind of an easy way you have to kind of adjust and work with massage your geometry as you need it to, right? These aren't like kind of explicit dimensions and constraints as you might be expecting from like something like Inventor, for example. So this is not a parametric modeler where, Inventor very much is a solid parametric modeler. If you're looking for constraints, if you're looking for dimension annotations and stuff like that, there is a parametric environment where you could set up geometric constraints and put in linear dimensions and stuff like that. This is just, yeah, I don't see too many people use this. It is available. It is functional for sure. I think if you are interested in parametric modeling, you might already have access to Inventor, depending on what kind of company you're at, but feel free to reach out if you have more questions about that. That is just one small nuance from AutoCAD to Inventor. Inventor is explicitly a parametric modeler, while AutoCAD is not, right? And in general, when I describe AutoCAD to people, I kind of describe it more as a drafting program, a drawing program, more so than Inventor is, right? Where Inventor is, again, strictly about modeling and parameters. It's a bit of nuance, but nothing I'll dive into here today, but just keep that in mind as we start drawing and using some of the modified tools, for example. All these different modified tools, or all the different properties that I mentioned earlier, this is kind of a good way to just kind of understand what you have selected, right? And what's kind of neat too is that you could go through and you could do some selections, something like this. And if you select multiple objects, it'll give you as much information as is common among all 28 objects. But you could also look down the pull down, look at the lines specifically. Maybe I want to move all the lines to a different layer, look at all the circles specifically and do something like that. That's a good way to kind of also kind of take and parse through your model as you need to, right? Yeah, there you go. So something to keep in mind. And let's see. Let me talk about some of the modified commands too. So I do want to keep talking about properties, and we'll go into layers shortly after this, but let me talk about some of the modified commands that exist here as well. So typical workflow of Inventor and other drawing programs like Inventor is where you put down basic geometry, like however you need it to show up as initially, right? And then you often have to take a second pass and start doing modify commands to finish geometry, right? To finish geometry. Yeah, there you go. And so really simple stuff, like all this stuff is super classic, and all of these commands end up appearing in Inventor as well, right? So like move, rotate, copy, mirror, a lot of these kind of translate directly into Inventor in various ways, which is an interesting thing to note as well. But that said, like move, like what the heck does move do? And it might not work the way you expect it to, but move, I click it, and what is it even telling me to do? There's no dialog box. Well, if you look at the bottom, it's telling you to select objects. So yeah, I want to select all these objects. And I'm going to use my crossing window, for example. If you're ever in a command and you need to advance the command, a good way to advance the command is simply just right click. And now it's going to ask me to specify the base point. And this is, again, kind of a drafting thing in AutoCAD. You have to select the base point from which to move things, right? So in this case, I'm going to use this point as a kind of grip point to hang on to stuff. I'm going to turn on ortho mode so I could move freely. And now you could see that it's essentially going to pick up all the objects I have and move it based around that anchor. So like so, right? Super easy way to kind of pick stuff up like that. Type in M, enter, oops, what am I doing? Move. Choose base point, and now you can move this around however you want to, right? So kind of adding on some layers to our previous commands and stuff like that. A lot of extra options over there. Move obviously helps you move stuff. Copy, super similar, right? I could mouse over everything, right click, select copy point, and then it's actually going to make a copy. And I can now use it to kind of like stamp around and stuff like that, right? Kind of neat. Similarly, rotate, right? As you might expect it, I could select all of this. I could select all of this, right click, oops, repeat rotate, choose a rotation point, and now I got bubbles or something like that, just like that. Easy way to rotate, right? Mirror, stretch, scale, all kind of similar stuff as well. Let's see if we could do it here. There we go. Now we got like mirror, right? So we could mirror it, something like that. Enter, kind of wacky looking. Scale also kind of operates kind of funkily as well, but we could see what that looks like here. Highlight, press scale. What I'm doing there, it's like called the pre-select specifically, right? So you select everything, initiate the command, and then kind of leads you to the next step automatically. They're kind of neat. And then stretch is a bit funky of one over here. Let me see if I could get something that works. The stretch is a funny one just because you kind of have to be careful with your selections, like something like that. And then specify the base point. And then see it's kind of stretching out like that while keeping the lines connected, right? And so there's a bit of kind of nuance kind of dealing with polylines versus unconnected lines. Some commands work with polylines, some of them don't. Like stretch is a good example of that, for example. And we also have stuff like array on here as well if you want to make like a pattern of things. So click on that circle. And this is relatively new too. So if you're coming from an older version of AutoCAD, it might not look like this, and doesn't even look like this in Inventor, in fact. But you have kind of this weird heads up toolbar that allows you to go through and choose like columns, rows, spacing, and stuff like that. And there's also kind of like pick handles on the actual model where you could, go through and actually just expand this yourself if you really wanted to, right? Kind of a neat one for sure. I haven't seen that really a lot myself in any other program quite yet, but there's like spacing, as you can see, right? Really easy way to kind of just produce a lot of geometry using the array tool over there. And similarly exists also in the polar fashion as well, or along a path if you're so interested, right? A lot of possibilities right off the bat over there, okay? And another fun trick about this all as well is that if I draw like a square like this, and I have a selection on it, you can actually get to a lot of these modify commands by clicking on one of these pick points like this, right? And by default, like it's already kind of moving it in a sense. And if you press spacebar while having one of these highlighted like this, it'll actually transition to the next option. This is move, for example, using that as a base point. This is rotate. Press space again. This is scale. Once again, rotate or mirror. And then we're back to the beginning, right? It's kind of a neat way to kind of just interpret everything, I think, because yeah, it's again not a parametric modeler, so you do have to be a bit more intentional with like your picks and clicks and stuff like that for things that come up for this. But I hope that makes sense. Do we have any other questions so far? All right, cool. Let me see. Let me see what we have. Let's get into layers over here as well. As I was just talking about like the modify commands, but layers are where it gets particularly interesting, I'll argue. So I'm going to clear out some of this stuff over here, Cool. And what we're going to do from here, we're going to go ahead and talk a bit about layers and what that means and stuff, right? So everything we've seen so far, like the regular draw commands and the modify commands, that should be enough to kind of get you started and drawing, right? You should be able to do a bunch of stuff, and we'll come back for trim and fillet and stuff like that in a little bit. But for now, let's talk about kind of layer properties, because this is also going to feature heavily in anyone's workflow from here, okay? Layers are effectively just ways to organize your geometry, right? So if you're familiar with stuff like Adobe Photoshop or Illustrator, right? I mean, layers are used to just kind of build up on certain pieces only when you want to work on a certain piece, right? And so in this case, most drawings start off with a zero layer, right? You can't mess with the zero layer. Don't do anything crazy with zero layer. You can technically do some stuff with zero layer, but just best practice is just not mess with it too much, or else, AutoCAD needs zero layer to operate essentially. If you want to make a new one, I believe it's Control Alt N. I always say Control N, but you could click the first button to get a new layer. So layer one will be that, I could click it again. Let's work with like 3 different layers. And each of these layers contain various properties, right? So depending on what geometry is on there, you could apply like a visibility on or off. You could freeze a layer, lock, plot, color, choose a line type, choose a line weights, transparency. That's all that's probably the most pertinent stuff, honestly, but let's talk about what all of those mean individually, right? So the light bulb in general in Inventor and AutoCAD, refers to visibility, right? So visibility, if you wanted to see it on or off, freezing means is it loaded or unloaded, and locking means is it locked or unlocked? So can you make changes or can you not make changes specifically, right? This isn't necessarily as robust as like vault security or something like that for blocking write permissions and stuff, but it's kind of just like a precautionary measure so that nobody makes unintended changes when they don't need to on a particular layer. Okay, so let's see what that looks like here really quickly. I'm actually going to also choose some colors here as well. So why don't we call this like blue or something? That's a good blue. Not the best blue. Let's do that. We'll do like red over here, and then I don't know, maybe we'll make this last one green. Whatever works, And so now layer 1, 2, and 3, we have blue, red, and green. And let's see what happens when we start drawing here, right? You'll notice when I start drawing, absolutely nothing just changed. If you want to switch layers, all you got to do is go to this pull down up here, go to layer 1. And once it says layer 1, you could start drawing again. There we go. Now when you draw, it's going to go ahead and have those properties of that layer that you're interested in. Okay. Something like that. And so like color is the only thing that we changed over here, but you could see if I go to layer 2 and do the same thing, it's going to continue taking those layers and those colors with it, of course. And then layer 3 for green, of course, as well. Okay. And, that's great. Now you have multiple line colors. You could set up multiple layers if you wanted to. You could do a bunch of other stuff here as well, mind you. And so like if I turned off visibility of the first layer, for example, like that's not going to show up anymore. I could freeze layers as well, which will also take it off the screen, but it's a very small difference. But freezing a layer essentially takes it out of memory. So it unloads it and a bit more connected to performance than it is to visibility and accessibility, like the visibility option at the beginning. The lock is kind of nice too, because it takes a little kind of darkens a little bit. So just to be aware of that, right? But the other things you might be interested in changing on here as well is possibly like line type, right? So if you click on line type, like if you don't want continuous, you want something else, you could get this window, click on it, load in some stuff. Maybe I want the ISO dash, for example. Let's see what that looks like. That'll load in this option, and now I could click OK and set it to a particular layer, right? Now everything on that layer is going to be represented with the ISO center line over there, which is great. It doesn't always show up like you need it to, right? Just depending on scale and stuff like that. There's a lot of stuff to consider there, but we'll talk about styles in a bit. Let's say like for this one, oops, cancel. And maybe I want to change the line weight on something like this. Like I want this red layer to be fat, something like that. You'll notice that, again, nothing changes over here. But why? It's because we don't have our toggle line weights on over here, which again is this option over here. If you don't have that option, make sure you click on your 3 lines over here and you choose the line weight option so that it appears over there. Right? Generally, I am reluctant to say like a blanket statement, right? But again, you're kind of working in a computer, you're working with lines, you're working with points where accuracy is really important. And so having line weight on is kind of nice for like visuals, especially on like printed objects, for example, or printed documents. But it's not always like clear, like, which one is which from here, right? Oh, it's like my snaps are being all wacky now as well. So, it's not always clear like when these intersect or when they don't intersect, and maybe you have to make your snaps particularly smart or anything like that. It can be kind of a hassle, especially when you're not working precisely. But that's the reason why people may want to toggle this on or off, right? Where I could work it with it on, where I could make sure I'm placing everything I need to place it at, and then boom, okay, this will look good on a print. Why not? And then that's when people start using that line weight function over there. So something to keep in mind for sure. Notice like when I start clicking on objects as well, and I could pull up properties again, it'll start giving you more information about this object specifically. And the information about this object is unique in that it is dynamically driven by a layer option. And so like color, for example, the color of this object that I have selected is set by layer. What is the color from the layer property saying? It's saying this weird magenta color. It's red magenta color, right? I could go through and I could choose something else, like by block, for example. If I have block information going over here, I could also turn it yellow. I could also turn it green, or maybe I just want to match the same green on layer 3. If I change the color of this line object to green, does that mean that it is then on layer 3? No, it just means that you overridden the color so that instead of driving it from the layer properties, you're just assigning it a green value, right? Not typically recommended. And if you could drive your properties, especially the aesthetic properties, off of your layer properties, that would be ideal, because now you have a single source of truth where everything else comes in. That's a really common call that we get as well, where people are like, why is this line green? You know, I set it up so that this line would be blue instead in this layer. And that's where all that information kind of drives from, right? So AutoCAD is, you know, with a lot of things in life, I suppose, a lot of preparation you do ends up paying off dividends and efficiency later on. So just be aware of that, and you won't have to spend time searching for random stuff like that and errors as you go through and do your stuff. You might be wondering, like, okay, Adam, like, that's great and all, but what if I just wrote a piece of geometry on the wrong line or on the wrong layer or something like that? Could I push it to a different layer? Answer is absolutely. Just go ahead and select the objects that you're concerned about, go to your pull down over here, and then you could choose it and push it to a different layer like so. And that's really easy. And again, these were obviously read before, but again, remember the properties of these lines were by layer. So as long as the by layer information is accurate, you're good to go. Okay. So well, I should also mention line type scale and stuff like that too before I leave. So prop over here. So looking at this object over here, right, what do we got? There's a few other things you might be interested in, right? I think in particular, the line type scale is a common feature that shows up. We're obviously in ISO kind of scaling right now, but oftentimes depending on the size of your drawing and the size of your actual styles and stuff like that, this might need to be adjusted, right? So like 0.01, for example, would look something like this, right? Where, you know, not necessarily what we wanted, but it's just really small. It'll depend on scale and everything like that. But, you know, if I were to start drawing on this layer, like at a really zoomed in level, like something like this, like that's like a, well, let me switch to the right layer first. So layer 1, you know, like that's a solid line. That's not a center line. But again, we're working at scale with an ISO scale. And so, you know, you might be interested in picking this up, properties, and then now we come in over here. Now that looks like a center line, right? Maybe I even have to go even smaller, like, you know, something like that. And, you know, that's a bit more obvious, right? But it'll depend on your scale of the drawing and what you're working with ultimately. And so pull back over here. This is fine for the kind of length that we're working with, but just be wary of that. That's a really common thing that shows up as well, where people are like, I thought I put line style, but it's not showing up as the line style. Check your scaling, see what happens, and check your scaling, okay? Okay. Any questions or concerns from here? Any ideas, any concerns, any worries? We're coming up on the kind of last block over here, I think. And last thing I want to talk about, well, second to last thing I want to talk about, well, third to last thing I want to talk about is blocks. So let's talk about how we make blocks inside of this program as well. So again, a lot of your time in AutoCAD, you know, could be spent drawing, could be spent modifying geometry, managing layers and stuff like that. The ultimate goal of any CAD program, I think, any of our products really, is about saving time ultimately. And so as much effort as you put into your original drawings and draftings over here, the question ultimately becomes like, can I repeat this, and can I do it faster next time I do this particular project, right? The answer is yeah, of course. There's always a way to kind of improve and stuff like that, right? And so in particular for AutoCAD, what does that mean? Well, for AutoCAD, it just means that I want to be able to save complex geometry that I work on, right? All the tools you have are, you know, relatively good at drawing, but they still require some kind of finesse to actually get the pictures and drawings that you actually want ultimately, right? So it makes sense that we'd want to, or that we have a function that allows us to save geometry together so we can reuse it in the future as well. Okay. And this is where the block workflow comes into things, right? So once I have a bunch of decorated geometry, I could start working and creating blocks. Okay. And so the way I'm going to approach this, I'm going to go ahead and start drawing some stuff so that it, you know, appears on screen and everything. And I think we will go to our sample at this point too, though, because context is important for our drawings, right? And so this is the drawing that I want, exterior elevation. Then I'm going to drop it into AutoCAD in the back by dragging and dropping it out. I don't think that worked. Hang on. Oh, no, I just kind of want to open it though. That's what I want to do. Does this still work? I'm going to say yes. Okay, so that still works on the home screen is what I did. So if you guys didn't catch that, I was on the home screen in particular, right? The start screen, and I just dragged the DWG into the start screen, and that will open up the drawing automatically. It'll give you this error because these sample files are read only, which is totally fine. I'm going to go ahead and say yes anyways. That just means that the original file is not going to be changed or anything, right? And this is like an exterior elevations drawing from AutoCAD, right? I'm not a huge building guy myself, you know. I have a mechanical background and manufacturing background myself, but so this might make more sense to anyone doing buildings and stuff like that. But these are kind of elevation drawings. So this is the side of the building. There's not like an actual model of the building at this point, right? But we were able to throw together enough lines and kind of squares and stuff and annotations to kind of, you know, represent the side of the building and get some general dimensions that would be passed on to the next step of the workflow, right? Great. Having a good time. And you know, certain stuff like windowsills, for example, like these aren't saved entities. These are multiple objects kind of just smashed together until they kind of work out as you might need them to. Totally great, man. It's no problem. But can we make this easier on ourselves so that we can go do some other stuff? The answer is yes, you know. And this is a common use for blocks, right? So stuff that is often repeated, right? Like windows or doors or like, you know, roofing and stuff like that are all good opportunities for stuff like blocking, right? So let's see what this block looks like here. And this is in architectural units. I don't think I've mentioned units at all in this presentation yet, but if I type in units, press enter, you can actually see how the drawing units are affected over here, right? There's something to say about units as well. So like AutoCAD's kind of odd in that, well, it's not odd, I'm sorry, but it's interesting in that like everything's 1-to-1. So like 1 inch is equal to 1 millimeter, is equal to everything else essentially. So it's kind of agnostic of units, but it'll depend on how you represent everything and kind of go do your stuff. In this particular case, the biggest takeaway is that, you know, I have decimal, I have engineering notation, I have fractional notation. Architectural notation is notably going to be the whole comma and double comma thing that you may or may not be used to, but just bear with me as we go through it, or I'm just going to be talking in inches and feet as we go and draw this kind of would-be window, okay? So cancel that, get me out of here. We're going to draw a window, okay? Okay, so how do we draw a window? Well, it's not so bad. We're going to start with a rectangle polyline. Let's see how that pans out for us. And this doesn't matter where. I'm just going to start drawing over here though. And so, you know what? I do want to do the lines actually. So I'm going to start with the regular lines, but my dynamic input is off. Let me turn that on over there so I can see what's going on exactly. Yeah, and then here we go. So here's what we're going to do. I have the rectangle command selected over here, and this is going to be a 4-foot by 3-foot window, right? Or yeah, 4-foot by 3-foot window. 3 foot and then 3 feet over here as well. All right. Relatively good window, pretty solid so far, having a good time. And again, I used the rectangle tool to kind of simplify that input, and you saw the dynamic input fields where I could tab between them. Again, noting that if I want 4 feet, I just type 4 apostrophe and that gets me what I need, okay? I'm gonna draw some offsets over here. Yeah, let's draw some cross beams first, actually. I think that makes more sense. And to draw some cross beams, right, I wanna go top down and left to right, but I don't have any of my snaps set up. So what I'm gonna do from here, I'm gonna shift right click and I'm gonna snap from midpoint. And that'll allow me to start this line at the midpoint of the right edge. And if I do it again, shift right click midpoint, I could go ahead and come in over there. I'm pressing space to reinitiate the line commands. Midpoint override, all the way down here as well. Although note that I could also, if I really wanted to, start midpoint like this. And maybe I just do like perpendicular or something like that, right? something like, Inventor has very explicit relationships, and when you set up your constraints and stuff like this isn't as strict. So you could pretty much do whatever you want as long as it looks right at the end. But keep in mind who else might be editing your document as well, but it's not as big a deal as it would be in something like Inventor, for example. But that said, let's go ahead, and I haven't talked about the fillet command. It's another one of the modify tools that are available to you guys. Right, the offset command allows you to pick up a piece of geometry, right, after you set a distance, of course. And so once I do that, I could click through, and I'm sorry, I don't know if that was clear enough for you guys, but the offset command, right, it's always asking for like an offset distance where I could kind of specify it over here if I wanted to. So like, I believe this is going to be like 1 inch, I want to say. So like 1 inch, like so. And then I could go ahead and select my object, and I could push out an offset, which is again a continuous kind of offset of the same geometry out or in a particular distance, right? The other option for offset is simply selecting on the object, right? I want to do through, for example, select an object, and then I kind of have a dynamic input using the would be through option, right? I'm not sure why it's named through, but I mean, maybe like through to this point that I'm about to select, I don't know. But at this point, I also have the dynamic input there as well. So I could do one quotation mark and get my kind of inch offset over there as well. I want to do the same thing, and this time This time what I'm going to do is start the offset command. I'm going to specify 1/2 inch specifically, so 0.5 inches in particular, because I'm actually going to select this object, push it out 1, select this object, push it out 2, and so that this is still symmetric around their centers over here, right? And once I have something like this, right, I mean, this looks pretty sick, this looks pretty dope. But I do have some lines to clean up. And so the other kind of big half to modify geometry is using the trim command in particular. The trim command did get some updates. I don't recall if it was 21 or 22 specifically, but now the trim command acts more similarly to how it does in Inventor, where you simply just kind of mouse over the parts that you want to delete, and it'll pick up the 2 kind of cutting edges around it, and it'll kind of just take it out from there, right? In the past, what you had to do was select your cutting edges first. So like for this line, for example, I would have to choose top and bottom, and then I would have sliced out this piece over here. But now it's just a single click, and there is a way to go back to the old method if you really want it, but I genuinely just don't recommend it. It's yeah. I think this is like a unilateral improvement over the previous way we used to do it. And so I'm just clicking and dragging kind of a lasso path through the edges I want to cut out. So it's super easy to go through and do it, right? Not to worry about breaking lines, and we're pretty good. Ooh. I did double middle mouse click to do zoom extents, which is not what I wanted, right? And so now we still have some interesting stuff going on here, right? And so, I have portions of polylines over here. I have kind of orphan lines over here. You could already see that there is a good amount of geometry to kind of be aware of and to take care of as we move forward, right? And so again, this is another big reason why people do blocks, is just that I don't want to worry about this piece falling apart from this piece, right? But let's do the windowsill next to kind of see what's going on from here. I'm going to do another polyline. I'm going to do something like this, right? Let's call this like 4.5 feet by, let's do like 2 inches on the bottom, yeah? Double quote like that. And this is always kind of like it's my first kind of big stumbling block with AutoCAD. It's like, okay, well, I have pieces of geometry that I need to relate to each other, right? Like I need to move this windowsill so that it's aligned and coincident with the bottom of this. How am I supposed to do that? I don't have constraints like an Inventor, man. What am I supposed to do? The answer may surprise you. So I'm going to use my move command here, right? So I could click on this object over here, and I could just move it around, right? I could do my thing and do all that stuff over there. What's really big brain about this, though, is that what we're going to do is that I'm going to select an object to move, right click, and right here, when it asks me to specify the base point, right, I'm going to actually use my snap overrides to choose the midpoint of this guy over here, right? This is therefore symmetrical on this particular square, right? And now I want to line it up with another midpoint of my particular drawing, right? Which in this case would be another snap midpoint right over here, like so, right? And so it's kind of a funny nuance there, right? Just because, we have to not necessarily align them, right? We're not like technically like choosing one object, the other object, and clicking the align button. And again, I used to use like Photoshop and Illustrator, for example, and there's a whole suite of just align buttons in Adobe products, right? Where you just click objects and then they'll align along a center line or something, right? We don't have that benefit here, unfortunately. But what we can do is, kind of use our constraints and our snaps in kind of intelligent ways, right? So snap midpoint on the move allows me to override and push it on another midpoint for the actual window. And therefore that these are two, technically aligned along the vertical symmetry now, which is what we want, right? And that'll depend on your design ultimately, but that's something that's kind of how you use AutoCAD, is to make sure that you're kind of placing everything where it needs to be placed, essentially. And that's what object snaps are for, right? So that's why we spent so much time on that at the beginning there. So I hope that makes sense. And again, now we have a bunch of different geometry. And if I wanted to, I could select everything, Control C, Control V, and like that's like an extra window technically. But there is a lot of extra stuff here still. And so I can still break this and move it around, which isn't ideal, right? What we want to do next is take a closer look at the block functionality available here in the block section here. Comes on. And under insert and doing all this other stuff, pretty self-explanatory, right? You could insert stuff right here, or you could create or edit a block. What we're going to do is click the create button in particular. Create button allows us this dialog box over here, which may look intimidating at first, but we can just break it down really easy over here. I'm going to call this, give it a name, so Jumpstart, window, something like that. And we have to do a lot of work here. So base point is, base point. So where am I going to be able to pick up this block and where I'm going to be able to handle it? So I could pick on the actual part. And again, now that I'm in a command, I can also reference those object snaps as I need to. So right click, midpoint, bang. Perfect spot for a base point for me to use, and it'll pick up the coordinates that if you have those, that'd be great, but it's a lot easier to just pick the point on the actual geometry, right? Objects, I could click this button right here to activate a selection set. So I click this, and now I just draw a selection window over everything like so. And if I'm done, I just right click to get back to my option over there, and it's already pulling in a thumbnail, which is awesome, right? And then behavior over here, I'm not going to really talk about annotative scaling here today, but you do probably want to keep allow exploding on. That's usually helpful. And that's pretty much all we need over here, right? So all I did is define a name and define a pick point for the base, and also selected the objects for everything over there. Maybe add in a description if you're going to be collaborating with this sort of thing, which is another conversation, but just let us know if you have questions about that. Go ahead and click OK. And nothing really happens right off the bat, but you'll notice that when I go in here now, like I select one part of this whole block and it's going to highlight everything. So it's essentially wrapped up all of this geometry into a singular object that now I could use and move around with this pick point over here, which is great. And one point I didn't make about this as well is that I did draw this on the zero layer. So it's pretty important that blocks get made on the zero layer, just because the zero layer has some very specific properties, and by doing so, it'll allow you to kind of use this a bit more dynamically in other places in your program. Not the end of the world if it's not, but something to have that you should be aware of, right? And the question now is, right, okay, well, Adam, what the hell do I do with that? That seems not that interesting, huh? And I'm like, you're right. If you want to, though, if you ever want to place a window on your particular drawing, all you have to do is go over to Insert, pick the window, and you just drop it in there, man. Like, that's it. You have windows for freaking days now, right? There's a bit to be said about like libraries and like working with blocks and collaborating and stuff like that. It's a bit of a bigger conversation about how you collaborate and stuff like that, but just for individual use, even it's like still pretty useful to know how you make and access and insert blocks as well. Kind of an interesting one too, in that your block libraries, quote unquote, are actually just DWGs that contain blocks in them. And so if I wanted to use the same window block again, I would have to reference this drawing to then pull in the block that it has, right? It's more than I want to get into here today, but just in general, if you need to save geometry, there is very easy ways to do so. And then you can keep repeating that for a while, then collaborate on the future for drawings and anything else you might want to do from there, okay? And so that's blocks, right? And more importantly about these particular blocks over here, bring it up here, right? Now, if I wanted to, what I could do, I could highlight this and I could just move this to another section like elevation post. And again, it's going to inherit those properties of that layer there as well pretty easily, which is what we want to see. Okay. I'm going to take another pause over here, but any questions about blocks or anything like that? There's more to say about collaborating in libraries for sure, but I'll probably leave that for a more dedicated discussion in the future. Okay. Any questions? All right, okay, let me take a sip of water here before we get into the last part. The last part we want to talk about is probably going to be drawings and stuff, right? So let's talk about drawings and paper space in particular. So let's take a look at the checker's guide, make sure we're keeping us honest over here. Design, properties, modify symbols, and then layouts, annotate, dimension. Okay, let's start there then, yeah. So take a pause here. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Thanks for that little break, everybody. I went to sleep with the fan on last night and my throat is like killing me right now. It feels awful. I hope it's not anything worse, you know, but don't recommend it, especially if we're going to be talking for a couple hours straight the next day. Last thing we should cover about AutoCAD, right? AutoCAD, all about drafting and drawing. It's about circles and squares and circles. And more importantly, perhaps, it's about drawings and paper and printers and stuff like that, right? And so I understood that paper space in particular and layout space was a relatively, it was a later addition in addition to the regular model space and stuff like that. And so just general perspective and stuff, right? A lot of people, and I think a lot of more classic kind of applications of AutoCAD, largely you just build out your drawings in the model space, right? That's a totally normal thing to do. And you just pretty much just keep everything that you need in the model space itself. You could run prints off of this environment. You can do whatever you want over here as well. But not everyone necessarily does that. And just as common of a workflow is the paper space itself, right? So two distinctions there is that this is model space that we've been in, that we've been working in. So where you draw geometry, this is where everything is basically one-to-one, right? So when we talk about annotations like this, for example, like this is a true 8-foot, you know, annotation on here to the model, right? And in a similar vein, right, the annotations are also going to be the same size about. So like this 8-foot zero notation, this is also the same size as this window, essentially, right? Which I'll come back to like styles and scaling in a little bit, but just bear in mind that you could place annotations on the model space, even if the model space is a one-to-one model, right? That's totally fine. Where things get kind of tricky and like where things, you know, you might have to transition into the real world eventually, right, is when you actually get to printed drawings, right? Printed drawings could refer to physical drawings, of course, but they probably more often now refer to PDF and digital drawings in particular, right? So this is great. You might want to polish it up some more when you publish it to an actual published format though, right? And so that's where paper space comes in. We've been talking about model space. You could see we are in fact in model space down over here. Great, cool. If you want to switch, you can just click on model space and boom, we're in paper space now. Should look pretty different, right? And you'll notice you have all your kind of regular tools and stuff up over here, right? If you want to do regular sketches. We also have a layout tab now, which will allow us to do certain things in the layout view, right? A lot of extra tools over here that I'm probably not going to talk much about. There's only a few that I really need over here, but layout space is a different environment. Paper space is a different environment where we're going to have to abide by a few different rules, keeping in mind the kind of real world implications of what we're about to do over here. Okay. And so I'm going to actually keep this drawing open. And if you mouse over the tab over here, like the drawing tab, exterior elevations, you actually toggle between model and layout space here as well. And you'll notice there's another third way, very common with AutoCAD, right? You could also click model or layout down here as well if you want to switch from one to the other as well. Okay, I'm going to clean up this model a little bit over here. Like I don't need these blocks here because they look kind of silly. And I'm just going to axe this. I think this is supposed to be the neighboring house, for example, but usually messes up my drawing and scaling. So I'll keep that kind of simple over there. Okay, something like that. And usually at this point, you've done all the drawing, you've done all your annotations, and now all you need to do is just put some views down on paper, right? Which is totally great. And This is what is called a layout specifically, right? And what the heck is a layout in particular? Well, it's really similar to like page setup. Like if you're familiar with Word docs, for example, or Microsoft Word, I should say. If you right click on the layout tab like so, right? And you go to page setup manager, right? You'll get this page setup manager, which has a list of either saved page setups. In this case, it's just layout one. So there's nothing special about this particular layout. This is just as is. This is your layout over here, right? And this is where you start to get some information about your kind of real world implementation, right? The device name, I'm going to be using the DWF printer. You know, you might have a physical plotter here as well. It doesn't matter, but I do have the plot size, so regular letter size 8.5 by 11, right? But you know, we need to kind of get into it a little bit. So let's click on layer one, make sure it's highlighted, click modify. This should look familiar if you've ever done like plots or prints from AutoCAD, right? This is simply just your plotting settings, right? So what is your printer, for example? And so is it a DWF printer? Like, do you want preview files like that? Or do you want PDF? Do you want like a physical printer? I have like Snagit or other desktop applications, all sorts of stuff. And this is, if you guys have ever tried to troubleshoot printers, I'm sure you know the kind of hassle of setting up printers one way or the other, whether they're physical or virtual. And so typically like the PC3 ones are kind of specific to AutoCAD's purposes in particular, but obviously if you have a physical printer, route to your physical printer as you need to appropriately and yada, yada, yada. For our purposes here today, we're going to be publishing purely to PDF. And again, even some of these might change depending on what your onboard PDF viewer and manager is. But in this particular case, right, I could just choose AutoCAD general documentation. But note that there are some other variations of the same PC3 file that allow you to do different qualities that you might be interested in as well. So general documentation is totally fine. And if you click PDF options, you can see that there is some more quality options showing up over here. So, you know, DPI, all this good stuff over here, line overwrite. I don't mess with that too much, to be completely honest, but it is still pretty useful, right? Just be aware that, you know, sometimes it could affect your quality, and this is where you could go in and change some of that stuff, right? Great. Anything else you want to be aware of? Depending on what printer you choose over here, your printer plotter, you're going to get access to different paper sizes over here, right? I always thought this is kind of funny because, you know, you have the different plot sizes, of course, and this refers to kind of the paper itself, right? But you could see some of these plotters just have like portrait and landscape mode. So like the architectural D, for example, which is like 22 by 34. I'm sorry, that's not quite right. I want this one. Yeah, 22 by 34, for example. And then they just switch the two dimensions to get like landscape or portrait and stuff like that, right? And this compounds with the other settings that you see on screen, like drawing orientation, right? So based on that page, is the drawing itself going to be portrait or landscape? Depending on what size you choose, it might matter, right? So just keep that in mind. And, you know, we want to do something like architectural D probably, and lengthwise specifically. So 36 wide, 24 tall, right? Plot, you know, you have some ideas for plot scale. I don't really mess with that too much. You have the option between display, layout window, and also plot origin settings. We'll come back to this in a moment, but just, you know, the main thing you want to choose at this point is just the AutoCAD PDF. Make sure you have the right paper size that you want to choose. Something like that, let's say. And then you can click OK. And you can see the way that the particular drawing layout updates itself, right? It's going to simply update and show you the new page size here, for example, right? Still not very clear, like, you know, what to do at this point. And so, you know, usually people have title blocks, mind you, at this point. And so at this point, you might want to go ahead and insert a title block if you have one from a particular library or something like that. Thankfully, this drawing, along with some other ones, has some default templates available. So, you know, from template, for example, is one that I could do. And I'm going to pull in the template that says tutorial-iarc, which happens to be a layout that I could actually import into this drawing, right? D-size layout, yes, please. All right, and now I have this layout over here, which already has a title block, and it also has a page setup or associated with it right off the bat, right? I'd argue this is probably one of the better ways to just manage kind of layouts and title blocks and everything like that, right? Because you don't necessarily want each individual user figuring out how to place their own title blocks in their specific square. Like maybe it doesn't print right, maybe it doesn't do that right? This is part of a larger conversation about standardization and kind of ease of use for your users and everything like that. This particular one does come with a viewport right off the bat. The viewport is a window into the model space. So We are currently in paper space, of course, but if I double click inside of the blue viewport, I actually changed to model space, which you could see highlighted at the bottom over there. And inside of here, right, and this is a locked viewport, and I can't really do much with this at the moment, but I could unlock it using this button over here. And now I am free to kind of move this around, zoom it in and out and stuff like that. And I could, orient this view and stuff like that. This is model space. And if I start drawing stuff, like a little circle or something like that, and I double click outside of this and then go back to model space, you'll trust me that this is in fact consistent with what we're seeing on model space. So, go crazy there. Yeah, and so for the most part, I mean, I don't care for this default viewport over here, but once you have your layout set up, right, you have the right page size, you have the right plotter, you have your title block placed in here. And in fact, one more thing you might want to do before you do anything else with title block is actually set up your attributes, right? So if you double click on a block like a title block, they should have mappable values already. This isn't true for every block by default, and it depends on your specific company, what they're doing, right? But from here, I can just go through, and these are actually fields that I could input over here, right? So Adam Evangelista, revision dates, let's call this rev date, okay. You'll notice that when I zoom in over here, it doesn't show up over here, right? Interestingly, it shows up over here in particular. So this is actually just kind of a quirk of this title block, and you could set up your title block to have these fillable fields anywhere that you want. And depending on your workflow, like if you have Vault, for example, there's a lot of workflows where you just pull in metadata that gets mapped automatically to certain parts of your title block, for example. But we're not going to see that here today. So just keep that in mind. And that's one way you could fill out title blocks if you have your attributes for the block set up. If they're not set up, hey, maybe tell your guy, be like, hey, yo, my Adam said that you could make mappable title block attributes. What's the deal? How come you haven't done that? And you could send them to me and I'll talk to them if they give you any flack, That said, what else do we want to do at this point? Make a viewport. So how do you make a viewport? Funnily enough, like I know there's a way to do it off of this layout tab. I actually don't know which one it is. I think you might do rectangular or something like that, which should just let me draw a viewport like that. If you don't like that, I've been taught MView specifically will allow you to do it. So if you just type in MView, that should be the same type of thing where you could just drag and drop one out there. So maybe it's just rectangular is the one that you need, but it doesn't matter. Once those viewports come in, right, you could click on them, double click in them, zoom in there and stuff like that. But you do want to take care of the extant geometry first. And so something like this, right? And I can't emphasize this enough, but like the viewports themselves and the boundaries that we're dealing with are not exact sciences whatsoever, right? There's obviously some snaps you could still do over here, but you don't necessarily need to worry about the dimensions of your viewports themselves, right? As long as you get the view that you want, you have pretty much a lot of freedom to do everything you need. And see, at this point, like I'm trying to place my stuff intelligently, but my snaps are getting in the way. So I might just turn off object snaps and place this a bit more intentionally, right? Something like that. Because again, I'm not worried about the snaps or the closures at this point. I just need it to have enough space to breathe and set up my views as I want them to, right? So in this case, it's just gonna be top and bottom, right? So maybe this is the bottom section over here, and all I have to do is double click inside of the window, zoom in like so. Really hard to see. Maybe around there, right? And then I'll double click into this one and I'll do the same like over here, right? Oh, that's a good angle right there. Look at that. And this isn't that interesting at this point, right? And I probably want to shore up the scaling just a little bit just to be consistent, right? Again, my background is not in building, so your mileage may vary on like how important your scaling is for this particular section, right? I know especially for building stuff, like drawings will often be presented with a scale and it has to be relevant, like, make sure it matches on paper so we could scale it up on the field and stuff or do whatever. But yeah, we're just going to choose something here. I'm at 1/10 or so, I think. I forget, 316. Yeah, okay, maybe a bit lower, 1/8. We will do 316. We could definitely manage that. So let's do that. So I'm going to do the same thing over here. So I'm going to call out 316 over here. Beautiful. Okay. And then specifically this guy, just like that. Move it down a little bit. So you see how these are like really small changes. It's just, I just really need to position this effectively so that it looks nice. Okay. And so now the important part of these viewports is the scale, mind you. And so that's the part that I'm really concerned about, making sure it looks good at a uniform scale. So 316, this is also going to be 316, right? And, at this point, like, this is honestly good enough to start printing and stuff. And so if I were, I could go ahead and hit plot. I'm going to go ahead and continue to plot a single sheet. That's okay. I have extra sheets over here, which is why it's asking me to do that in particular. But I could hit preview and I can see what I'm dealing with over here. This looks pretty good to me so far. It's kind of missing some edges on the bottom, which I don't quite like. And I'm going to see if I could get rid of that. But the big thing for me is that the viewport still has its edges over here as well. And for some reason, like, that's a huge thing to do. Like, you have to get rid of the viewport edges because it looks stupid otherwise, it looks bad. And so you almost always have to go through this step. And the way to get rid of those lines on your plot is to create a new layer in particular. So I'm going to go over to Home, do a layer over here. And there is a viewport layer here already. I'm just going to make a new one so you guys could see it, right? So viewport, okay. Viewports, plural. And the main thing I'm going to do here specifically is that I could even call it a different color just for, the sake of visibility, I guess. I don't know. There we go. And I'm actually going to toggle off the plot option over here. So anything on this layer is not going to plot, which sounds a bit counterintuitive given what we're about to do over here. But now I'm going to go select these two objects, move them to my viewports layer. Ooh, I had to sneeze. Viewports, the one without plotting right now. You can see the lines change because it's on a different layer now. It's fantastic. And now if I go ahead and run a plot, let's see what that looks like. Continue to plot single sheets, preview. And then now those lines are gone, right? So it doesn't really matter where you placed them originally as long as your actual view is good. Why is it like that? Like, isn't the viewport, on the actual, isn't that geometry on the viewport layer as well? I'm not really sure, honestly. So I always thought that was kind of strange that to get rid of the outside border, like, that's technically the only part that's not plotting, right? But everything else on this viewport is technically on a different layer. So you can think of it that way if it helps you, but that's kind of what it takes to get rid of those lines, and you don't have to worry about them too much, okay? And then from here, I should also mention just a little bit about kind of annotations and stuff like that. I always mention this one just because there's a lot of different ways to approach this, and it'll depend on how you want to do it exactly. Like I mentioned previously, these annotations that you see on screen over here are in model space. And so by default, if you're going to do annotations in model space, it's great. It's no problem, man. Just make sure that your styles are scaled up to match a one-to-one model space scale, right? Like I said, right, this building is one-to-one technically, right? That means that this lettering and this font lettering has to be at a similar scale where, this 2 is like 1 foot tall or something like that, right? It's pretty big. That said, where does that information come from? We could take a look over at annotations, and we could take a look over at, like, let's say, dimension styles, for example, right? Dimension styles will determine the scaling and the kind of relevance of all the stuff that you're trying to do over here, right? And so coming over here, I can modify the existing 18 Romans one, and you can start looking at where this information comes from, right? So lines, obviously, extended beyond, not too much. Symbols and arrows look relatively large over here, but, here's text, and text is going to be using another text style. So that's actually referencing something else, and we could look at that in a little bit, but primary units, yada, 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 alternate units, that's totally fine. And if I do the same thing for text, for example, like under here, manage text styles, you can see that over here, I guess it's not terribly tall, I guess comparatively, I could say, but depending on how you set it up, right, that's just your dimensions themselves are going to be kind of large like that. And so something to keep in mind, if I were to go to the drawing from here and try to place those same annotations on here, right, they would be ridiculous, dude. Like, look at that. Like, that's not an annotation I could use. That's huge. That's meant to be in model space. So that's why we have those dimensions over there, right? I could demonstrate this a bit more explicitly. Can I get rid of this? There it is. Okay. I could demonstrate this a bit more explicitly with the kind of text that we're working with over here. So let's just draw like a simple, text line over here. And so this will be like front view. And you can see over here, right? I mean, this is kind of way too large, right? So let's bring that down to like 1/4 instead of being a whole foot. And then there's our front view. So that was kind of wacky, wasn't it? But this is now our front view over here. And our font, instead of being like 1 foot tall, right? Again, keeping in mind that our paper was only like 22 by 36 feet. It's pretty tall, So front view over here is now going to be 1/4. And that's kind of what I'm talking about with the styles that you have to be aware of, right? And so you could keep using that annotation style if you wanted to, but just make sure it's scaled down so that it fits on the page that you need it to fit, right? There's some stuff you could do with like annotative scaling and dynamic scaling and stuff like that, but that's probably another course, honestly, probably another conversation. So I won't get into it too much from here. Like that, right? And that looks about right. So just keep that in mind where and when you do those annotations, okay? What else do we got over here? And I guess let me speak about the annotations for a little bit here as well, actually, because I do think they are interesting. I remember I think I learned AutoCAD in 2000, must have been 2009 or something, when I was in high school specifically. So quite a few year versions back. But you can see that, depending on which lines you choose, right, there's a few different options, right? So this pull down contains like explicitly linear, aligned, angular, arc depth, and stuff like that. And if you want to do a particular dimension, this is the one that you should do, right? So if I want to specifically do angular, choose angular, right? They do have this other one, this like smart dimension, dynamic dimension. I'm not sure what it's called anymore. But this one allows you to choose lines and the computer will figure out what the next, what the appropriate one is. So 2 intersecting lines, probably an angle dimension, right? But that's just a small distinction over there. So I think this used to be the default, and then this is the new sauce out there. It's much more dynamic, much more intelligent, much more intuitive. Now, I don't think it's that new of sauce, but there it is if you need it. And that's the only other thing I would say about dimensions before moving on, I think. Okay. And so let's finish this up just by taking a look at a few other plot settings that we have over here. Again, that's asking because I have multiple layouts over here. And if I were to delete the other layouts, right? Delete. Now, if I go and hit plot, it shouldn't tell me about, okay, maybe it does, I'm sorry. But yeah, batch plotting just refers to, printing out multiple sheets that are associated with the layouts for a drawing, which is not uncommon by any means, but we just want one. So that's what we're doing over here. So I usually just start with like a fat preview over here just to see what's going on. That's not too bad. And we could see how some of these other options affect this, right? So zoom extents, of course. I could do zoom layout, which we could see. Let's see how that matches over here. Let me change ArcD actually. ArcD should be 36 wide preview. Layouts. That looks, I'm still missing lines though. I don't like that. And so layout is over here. I could also do window, I suppose. Yeah, I think my scaling's a bit off is what I'm kind of getting at. I'm just going to leave it at extents for now. I think there's some stuff rubbing off of the you can see like a kind of dotted line, which is cutting some stuff off that I don't like. But let's preview that one more time. And you know what, I'll take it. I think that looks great. Let's run with that. And so once you run plot, right, you could always fit the paper in particular. I think that'll have some effect on the actual like scaling and stuff like that. So maybe don't get too crazy with that, but you could see it does finally fit in there. But I'm not sure if the actual scale of my views would then be preserved from there. But again, all choices you have from over here. And now my 1:1 and 1 to 1.015 units in particular. There's some other stuff that you might be interested in, like plot transparency is an option that often doesn't get toggled on when it needs to. There is like pen tables if you're going to do like different coloring and stuff like that for your line weights, because more often than not, you don't always want the drawing colors that you selected in the computer to be reflected in your actual final print. But very circumstantial, and you could change that in the pen plot styles if you have it. But for now, I'm just gonna run this because everything else looks good to me. I can go and click OK, put it on desktop, call this, Jumpstart plot. Okay, and then that should bring up our final plot over here. And that looks kind of gross in color, huh? Let's do one more, but with monochrome or something. So now for pen assignments, instead of doing the default none, I'm just going to go ahead and do monochrome so we could get a outright preview of everything. That looks much more presentable. So let's run that. Go ahead and click OK. And then desktop, Jumpstart. Beautiful. Look at you guys. You guys are champs, man. Right. And so that's how you make drawings, man. And so let me finish this out just by kind of emphasizing the kind of process that we just went through over there, right? Because that's going to be a very common workflow for most people. And I don't think everyone uses Paperspace by any means or kind of draws the same way I described so far, but that'll get you through pretty much any process that you need to, right? So again, we talked about just kind of basics, getting around the program. We talked about making basic geometry, modifying basic geometry, kind of some of the precision tools we have using object snaps and different stuff like that. Properties and layers heavily affect and a lot of downstream processes, right? So that's going to be a good place to kind of focus your efforts if you are trying to consolidate properties and stuff like that, okay? Of course, you can make blocks to save even more work and repeat everything. And then the Paperspace and layouts kind of be kind of where you set up your final drawings and prints, which contain their own kind of can of worms as well. But we covered all of that. And again, I highly recommend you take a look at this particular Checkers guide to see what's going on over there. And it'll cover a lot more than even I was able to cover here in this presentation. So keep a lookout for that as you go through it. That said, let's jump back to my presentation over here. An application help is absolutely indispensable, right? I tend, I'm guilty of not using it myself, but literally just this question mark over here will bring you to the in-document help, which has extensive documentation on pretty much all commands that you might be interested in, right? Google's just as well, honestly, but like, file dia, for example, if you want to look up like a command, like a system variable or something like that, it'll tell you the command, it'll tell you what values mean what, for example, and you could do it that way. That's in the help already. So that's one of the most direct sources of information about AutoCAD you're going to get any which way, just as well as Google. We talked about the Hitchhiker's Guide. And then we could also talk about the Autodesk Knowledge Network as well. This one's not, that exciting, I don't think, at least. But this is obviously Autodesk online platform where they, throw up information like documentation like we were just talking about, but also the community forums as well. So if you're like me and you end up Googling a lot of stuff when you need it, like you'll often come across these forum posts where these are actually moderated by Autodesk employees and specialists as well, whose entire job is to moderate these communities and provide technical answers. So it's not at all a bad place to be when you're looking for help. It's very good, in fact. And then I could also recommend our virtual academy. So KETIV pushes out a bunch of different material. We publish all sorts of stuff. Every week we do a 1-hour webinar hosted by yours truly, and we cover a bunch of different topics. We do tend to skew towards like, simulation and Inventor and Vault and everything like that. But we have a couple sessions dedicated to AutoCAD as well, and the other products because you might need it, right? And let's go ahead and you could just show you the channel over here, right? So we have videos coming out like, I don't know, multiple times a day or something like that, I think, at this point. And we have a dedicated playlist. So whatever you want, right? Whether you're looking for, Autodesk or, you look at customer stories, we have a bunch of stuff that you might be interested in. Okay. So definitely check that out. We have a lot of learning there, and those are all live too. So if you want to jump on and ask questions, it's a good place to be by any means. And I think with that, that's definitely a good place to go from here. I'll take a moment if you guys have any questions or anything like that from here, but let me know. This is where you could get additional support as well. So if you ever need help, feel free to reach out to us at support@ketiv.com or our hotline down over there. Both of those track directly to our support team. And, we have a crack team of specialists that would be happy to help you with any other troubleshooting questions from here. Okay. Good stuff. All right. And so that's pretty much all I got, guys and girls. Please let me know if you guys have any other questions. Again, feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions at our contact over here. But otherwise, thanks for another fabulous session and good luck. I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.